Hello, and thank you for joining us today, and welcome to this Hasselblad webinar. I hope you're all keeping safe in these tough times and are looking forward to spending the next hour with us. I'm Mark Whitney, part of Hasselblad's marketing team, and I'm coming to you today from my home in the UK. I'm also joined today by my colleague, Chris Cooze, who is Hasselblad's Global Technical Communications Manager. And today's webinar is the third in a new series of what we're calling Focus Q&A webinars. The Focus Q&A webinars are designed to be driven by you, the audience. To be held on a regular basis, you are able to suggest a question or topic for us to discuss as part of the registration process. And we then consider the topics and suggestions we've received and which ones to cover. And Chris will then cover them in each webinar. So I've just got a few slides to go through before we meet Chris. So as usual, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording of the webinar will be posted to the Hasselblad YouTube page within a few hours of the webinar, or worst case tomorrow morning. All our previous webinars are on there as well, so if you've missed any of our previous webinars, not just the Focus webinars, but all the interviews and technical presentations we've done as well over the past year, they're all on there for you to be able to look back on. And then just before I get to today's agenda, I just wanted to remind everyone of the previous topics we've covered in the last 2 months, the 2 previous runnings of the Focus Q&A webinar. We do get a few suggestions for topics that we've already covered. So if you're joining us for the first time, please note that these are the topics we covered in the previous ones. And as I've just mentioned, these are all on the Hasselblad YouTube channel page. So if there's any questions you have on any of these topics, please look on here. And if there's anything else that you'd still like to know, then please suggest them for any future Focus Q&A webinars. So today's agenda, we've got a variety of subjects today that Chris will cover. So first one being lens corrections. We've had a few questions about how to apply lens corrections, and also which ones are stored in the software and which ones you're able to configure for third-party lenses that aren't in the software. So Chris will cover that. Another topic being Focus Desktop and Focus Mobile 2 workflow. Had again a few questions about how to balance the two and to make them work together. So Chris will be covering that. Quite a few questions on virtual copies and save states. Chris did touch on this as one of the sort of random questions we had at the end of one of the previous Focus Q&A webinars. So we're now giving it a bit more of its own slot. How to work with different versions of the same file. It's slightly different than Focus, so Chris will be going through that. Tethered camera control with relation to Focus Desktop. So how to control the camera when it's tethered and to shoot. And then finally, exporting DNGs. Again, quite a few questions on exporting DNGs. So Chris is going to be going through the options we've got for that. So again, probably about 50 minutes runtime for Chris to cover that. It'll be a mixture of slides to start with, and then some practical with Chris actually going through Focus and Focus Mobile 2. So yeah, 50 minutes, and then that will hopefully leave us a little bit of time at the end for any questions. For the questions, if you could please have them related to today's topic. Any questions on other topics, please leave them to the next Focus Q&A webinar and suggest them there. So yeah, we'll only be answering questions relating to the topics that we're covering today. And mentioning the next Focus Q&A webinar, we've already got it scheduled in for the 22nd of September. So you'll receive an email following the webinar to thank you for attending, and we'll include the link in there if you then wanted to register and attend for next month's session. So hi Chris, how are you?
Hi Mark, yeah, fine, thank you.
Let me just throw the presentation over to you. There we go.
Thank you. Okay, so hopefully you should now be able to see my screen. Come on. Okay, there we go. So hi everyone. Let's start off with lens correction. So we've had a few questions about this in terms of what functions are available, what they can be used for, etc. So we'll sort of look at all of the items available and then how we deploy them. So within Focus Desktop itself, the lens correction tool, there's 3 main variables that you have control of. So once you actually switch the tool on, which we'll do live when we go actually to the software, you've then got the chromatic aberration option. There's three settings for that, basically off, standard, and adaptive, and we'll look at what the differences are in a moment. There's the distortion control, and this is a straight on-off, and basically this corrects for any remaining distortions that were left in the lens design that couldn't be, if you like, corrected optically, and therefore we then take care of those within the software correction. And then you've got a vignetting or light fall off adjustment. Now this one default is 100% to the level that we feel is fully corrected for illumination differences between the center and the corners, but obviously you can modify this as your heart's content, as it were, to get a specific effect should you wish. So with our current lens range, so this would be the HC, HCD, and current XCD lenses, all of the corrections are dynamic. So basically within Phocus, there is a matrix of corrections for all of the different combinations you can have. So for each lens, for the various adapters we have within the H system, and then the selection of this is done via the metadata. So once the file is imported, Phocus looks at it and it says, okay, this was shot on a 30mm XCD lens, aperture f8, and the focus distance was X. So effectively, all these variables are then used to work out which correction from the matrix that we have should be applied to this frame that you've got. And that's one of the differences with Hasselblad, that if you have a zoom lens, we don't just have a wide, a standard, and a long. If you have a 35 to 75 zoom and you've shot at 45mm, the correction will be based on 45mm and the focus distance and the aperture in use. Additionally, if you're using a H system lens and maybe the XH adapter or the 0.8 converter, all of those additions will be taken into account if you were then to take an image with an X1D or a 907X. The system would work out, oh, okay, this is on the 50 megapixel sensor, you've got a 0.8 converter and you're using this lens. So all of those modifications would be taken into account. So going back to the chromatic aberration correction. So we recently added the adaptive option, but standard corrections that are pretty much every manufacturer uses when they design a lens, they create a chromatic aberration correction based on the lens design. So within the design process, you know effectively the aberrations are going to show in the far corners and on the high contrast edges right in those corners. And so you can, through the design process, create a correction based on that design information. And that works very, very well for sort of 90–95% probably, if not slightly more, of all of the chromatic aberration that you have in an image. There are times though where you want the actual frame in use to be corrected. And yes, you could go, we have the defringe tool, you could go in manually and look at all of these, but that takes time to actually correct. And if you've got a few files, you may not want to do that. So we've now added the adaptive correction, and this will scan through each image as you click on it, select it, or if you wanted to, you could copy the adaptive correction across all files you are working on, so it will just do it automatically. But hopefully you can see with this frame here, this is a shot right on the edge of the frame, high contrast area with no chromatic aberration enabled. And you can see you've literally got colored fringes on both sides of the column here. So if we switch on the standard, so within this chromatic aberration here, we select standard. The system will then apply a standard correction, and it does a pretty good job. You know, this is zoomed in a long way so that you can see it. However, with the adaptive option, you can see because it's looking specifically at various parts of the image, it creates a custom correction, and you can see it's done a much better job in this case of removing that. The adaptive option can also be used to correct third-party frames or captures via third-party lenses, which we wouldn't normally be able to correct. So because this is a sort of on-the-fly custom correction, all we need to do is select the other option for the lens and adaptive, and chromatic aberration will be removed to the same extent on images captured with third-party lenses. So looking at that, if you were to be using a V-system lens through the XV adapter, or an X-pan lens again through the X-pan adapter, these are manual lenses, so there's no way that the system would be able to interrogate what the settings are. So to counteract that, you can choose the lens, the aperture, and the approximate shooting distance here. So we literally have, you know, 0.5 meter, 1 meter 3, 5 infinity. Now, obviously, probably you're going to be looking for this information after you've taken the shot, and best guess is fine. It doesn't have to be perfect. In terms of the lens options here, when you click the pull down, there's the other option that we just previously saw, and then the vast majority of V-system lenses are here, and the 3 X-pan lenses. So again, here you can select the lens that you use for the shot, put in approximate data here, and the system will then apply the correct distortion corrections, vignetting corrections for that specific lens on the X camera. In terms of third party, obviously we don't recommend that you just select a focal length that's equivalent. You know, if I was trying to use a larger image circle 35mm full frame lens, I couldn't just choose a lens that's close in focal length. The distortion levels would be completely different. But if I had a medium format lens, let's say you know, an old Bronica lens or something like that, 80mm, 150, and I was desperate to correct for the distortions, then I could choose a CF lens of similar focal length. It wouldn't be perfect, and you'd have to see what their distortion correction looked like, but you could select something there. But generally, this option here is most suited to using X-pan lenses and Zeiss V-system lenses on an X camera, or H camera, I should say, as well. So that's a quick roundup of the lens corrections. That's pretty much everything that you can select there. We'll see it in action in a short while. So Phocus Mobile 2 and desktop workflow. We've had a few questions recently over how do I get the best from it? What's the best way to do it? And there's a little bit of understanding really in terms of what each of the systems is designed for. So effectively, if I'm using Phocus Mobile 2, and let's assume I'm using an iPad Pro, I'm connected to the camera and I'm capturing images, and basically they're then being stored on the iPad. I can then select the files that I want to process straight away and modify them. So I have pretty much most of the main tools that you would want for image editing there. So I have my cropping tools, color correction tools, lens corrections, etc., all available there to apply to these images. And then I can then export those files as a JPEG. And I have a full size and a smaller JPEG option, which I can then share from my iPad immediately as a fully corrected, ready to go file. Meanwhile, your raw files are on the iPad within your folder structure that you've selected. We then select all the files, and there's various ways of doing this. You can use either AirDrop, or if you're using Mac iOS 10, 15 or later, you can use just literally file transfer. Earlier versions, you could even use iTunes if it's photo files. So there's various different ways of transferring the raw files from the iPad basically into your folder structure on your desktop machine. And then once you've got them there, obviously there'll be 3FR RAWs at that point. You'll then transfer them into your normal master folder system and then open up Phocus Desktop and start processing your images there. If you've rated the image in camera, or if you've assigned a red, green or amber option within the iPad, those rating functions will appear within the files when they open up in Phocus Desktop. And then you can then process your adjustments as you would want to, and then output them or print them direct. So this is where your normal desktop function applies and all of the tools will be available. So we'll run through that live in a little while. But that split workflow, the benefit really is that rather than having to carry around your laptop and all of the bits and pieces, I can just take my iPad, I can connect it to my camera, shoot tethered, or shoot to card and then import to my iPad after the shoot's finished. But normally I would shoot tethered because then I can check with the live view. I can make sure that everything's okay, if everything's set up. Plus I can then check the captures afterwards, make sure that everything's gone okay. They're sharp, they're well exposed, I'm happy with them before you then move on. It's just a way of checking without having to have your full MacBook Pro, something like that, to edit. You can have something smaller, lighter. Okay. The idea then is that you can very quickly edit and convert to JPEG for rapid sharing of certain files, maybe for the client, or just say, look where we are. And then when you finish, you've still got those full-fledged RAWs available to put into your desktop workflow and then export into whatever format you would normally use. So that one's probably more clearer when we actually do this live. Virtual copies. This has cropped up quite a few times now over the last couple of years in terms of requests for, do you have it, can it be done? And the simple answer really is we do not in Phocus have a virtual copy function in the same way that say Lightroom has, where literally you have one entry into the catalog and then multiple versions that you can compare side by side. That functionality per se is not available. However, what we do have is a way of storing within the raw file the different looks and settings that you've used when processing the file. And there's quite a list that's normally in each file, because effectively this is a text setting that goes into the header of the file itself. So it's not a separate file. By default, you have the standard settings, then any user settings that might be available within your desktop app, and then embedded in the file itself is the whole host of corrections that you've done. And by utilizing this store, we can correct an image to get a certain look, and then within the adjustments browser, I can then save that position and give it a name that actually means something. So something that makes sense to, it might be, I don't know, Venice Church, black and white, or so, it's something like that that makes sense. And then once you've saved these settings, you can reload them at any point. Now on the pull down here on the adjustments tool on the toolbar, I can select from this list. When I click on it, it loads that version. So all of the settings that were in there, so any crops, keystone, color corrections, etc. All of those are reloaded and applied to the file. You've then got, let's say this one, grayscale. If I'm in your browser, I can click grayscale and then load. And that will then do exactly the same thing, but it's a couple of clicks in this case as opposed to just one selection. So a couple of ways of doing the same thing. If you really like a sort of look and feel, you can then copy an embedded correction and copy it into user, which will then mean when I'm importing files, I can apply a certain, maybe a color look or a black and white style, and apply that to every file automatically on import. So we'll look at that in a little while. So in terms of the workflow, this is very, very simple. So we just capture as normal and we edit the raw files to get the look we want. You then save the adjustment. And then once you've saved it, by default, it's a time and date stamp that basically is used for each save position. You can then select the last one and rename it. Give it something that makes sense. And then you then carry on to modify to the next look. So normally you would have, at this point, maybe in Lightroom, you'd have said, right, I'm happy with that. Now I'm going to create a virtual copy and I'm going to modify this one to look this way. Slightly different in terms of we save one file, we then move on to the next one, get the look, and we save again and rename it. And that way you end up with a series of different looks and feels, and you can then reload them for that particular file time after time. And you can copy these adjustments. So if I, say I've got 50 sets of images coming in and I want them all to have the same adjustment, again, I can do that, apply it either on the fly or as an import. Many, many options. Okay. Now, remote camera control. Now, within the capture tab of the desktop app, you have the camera option here. And once your camera is connected, it'll tell you which brand, or sorry, which model of camera, how good's the battery. And then obviously here you have live view, mirror up if it's a H system, and then expose. The rest of these functions are what you would normally set on a camera. So, ISO, single shot, shutter priority, aperture priority, you can choose basically which one it is, exposure compensation, and so on. There's also the option to activate the autofocus, and then there's the fine adjustment of autofocus here. Generally, the remote operation is used when the camera is in a position that you can't get to without maybe knocking it again, or it's physically not touchable. So it might be up on a gantry with a long USB cable, up on the top of a copy stand. So it's not simple to reach up and change the settings. This way also then live view helps you check with the camera up in this inconvenient position, as it were. You can still check composition, focus, and the effect. So imagine we were using a tilt shift adapter. It enables you to see the change in the focus plane as you change the adapter. And obviously, generally, it minimizes vibration for exposures. Now, especially on a H system, if you've done all of the focusing, etc., hit the mirror lock, up it comes out the way, and then the actual exposure from the shutter in the lens is minimal. So the vibration from the lens shutter is absolutely minimal. Within the capture tab, which we'll look at, this is just one tool within that. You also have file naming options, file locations, and so on, and a few other bits and pieces which we'll look at. But that's all within the capture tab. Okay. So DNG exports. Recently had a few questions on this one as to, should I use it? What's it for? And I suppose going back a little way when Adobe released the DNG specification, that the whole point was that it was trying to create a universal RAW file that could be processed by pretty much all RAW converters. Not universally implemented, shall we say, by a lot of manufacturers. It had some benefits. The file is smaller because of the amount of information that's not needed for the DNG setting. But to make it compatible and not so large, basically, when you use the DNG export option from within Phocus, effectively you're just getting the equivalent of the 3FR file. So nothing's been applied, no lens corrections or anything else. You just get the basic capture as if it was coming from the camera, but converted into a DNG format. Your star rating and metadata that you've applied in terms of, maybe copyright information, etc., that is obviously into the header of the file. Additionally, the Hasselblad RGB color information, the color profile, is embedded in there as well. But nothing else you do to a DNG file within Phocus, even though it will look like the file has been corrected, when you hit the export for DNG, none of those will be applied for the export. It will literally take it back to zero settings, as it were, for a 3FR style export. Okay, so that's the presentation part. So now let's actually look at these items one by one within the Phocus app. So 1 second, sorry. Okay. So we're going to look at lens corrections. And just to cover off all of the items we briefly talked about, hopefully you can all see that. I've just floated the lens correction tool just to make it slightly easier when it sits on top of the image. And I'm going to do this, the quick and easy one first, the distortion and vignetting. So if I click on this file, it was from a 28mm wide angle lens. And this is with all of the corrections effectively turned off for distortion and vignetting. So you can see that there's a slight amount of sort of barrel style distortion there, but there's also, I don't know if you can see, there is a change in the illumination, basically from the center to the edge. And so if I switch on the distortion control, you can see they're pretty much flattened out straight away. And again, this is because the system has read the metadata, selected the correct information for the 28mm HCD lens, and applied that distortion correction. Vignetting, again, tries to match the illumination in the corners to the center. And again, if you wanted to, you can correct that manually if you want, but normally 100% is pretty good. Okay. If I go back to a normal image here, turn them off, you can see the sort of differences it will make in a real world image. So in this case, it's the same lens, 28mm, flattens the image down, and then we have corners brought up to the same level of illumination. So doing the job we want it to do. Now, in terms of corrections, there's the three that we talked about. So off, in this particular image, there probably wouldn't be anything much there that chromatic aberration would show on anyway. Standard and adaptive. If I now go to a image that was shot on a large format camera, obviously there's no lens information within the file. And so we then have to select that from the drop-down list that we looked at earlier. Let's just move that up a little bit so you can see the whole list. Again, if I was using a V-System lens, I could just select the relevant file here. So let's just move it to a 30mm, and then I could select the aperture and obviously the focus distance if I could remember it, or in this case we would just guess. Basically it's beyond 5 meters, so it goes on infinity is where the focus would be here. And that's it. So then those are corrections would be applied. However, if I was trying to use, let's say, a Canon or a Nikon lens on an X1D, unfortunately there's no correction here that would work. So all I can do is select other, which basically does no distortion correction, but it does mean that I can still use the adaptive setting for chromatic aberration in the corners, etc. So lens corrections themselves, very, very straightforward, not much for the user to really interact with. If I'm working with a file that was taken with a HCD lens, H lens, or an XCD lens, then I don't need to worry. Basically, the system interrogates the metadata of the file, works out which lens and adapter, etc. was used, and then will automatically select the correct distortion and vignetting correction from the matrix. You don't need to, as a user, do any of that. All you need to choose is, do I want to use standard or adaptive? That's pretty much it. Okay, so that's lens corrections. So I'm now going to move on to Phocus Mobile 2 and then the desktop workflow. Now to do that, what I'm going to do is briefly connect to my iPad and share the iPad screen with you. So if you might bear with me 1 second. And hopefully you can now see my iPad screen. Okay. Right. If I now work on my iPad, so I would then connect via my iPad to my camera for my shooting, which is what I did slightly earlier. So I took a few images of a print that we got up just to show X1D 65mm lens, and then a quick capture of that because we're going to use this when we're doing remote camera control in a short while. I have then, in this case, the raw file. So as you can see here, full raw has been transferred from the 907 onto my iPad. And then in terms of corrections available, you can see we have exposure, the full range really in terms of recovery, shadow, clarity control, everything, including even curves. Okay, so I can then adjust those curves should I wish. Further down, I have lens corrections, which we've just talked about. And again here, most of it is just a case of switching it on and being allowing the system to automatically correct. So once you work your way through, you know, as an example, if I can now adjust, let's say, the crop on this. And then once I'm happy, there we go. I have now got the option using the share tool down in the bottom corner to output a full size or medium size JPEG. There is the raw option, but we use that in a little while. The raw file won't encode any of your corrections as such, but if I output a full size JPEG, and then I can choose where's it going. So in this case, I'll save it to files, and I'll put it onto images, and then save. So that's my full-size JPEG exported. I can then share that through my iPad apps to whatever, maybe social media or whatever I want to do. I can upload that. So that's a full edit, basically on a raw file within the iPad. Now that works fine, but obviously, if you've got 50, 60 shots, you're going to want to transfer all of those RAWs from your iPad into your normal desktop workflow. So for that, we go back to album, and then we then have select. So if I hit select, I can then select either a group of images or individual images or everything basically. And then once I've selected it, I can then use the share icon at the top here, and then output whatever, in this case is JPEG full size. Come on. Deselect. Share, and I have 3FR RAW. Now I can select the RAWs, and now I can do exactly the same thing again. What do I want to do with it? So in this case, I want to airdrop it. My Mac comes up, and then I'm hoping to find the message. So that's just transferring those raw files for me. Done. And then from my location on my computer, I can then take those two files and copy them to my normal location that I would keep my raw files. That's probably the simplest way to do it. And I'll just do that so that you can see that it does work. And I will put it into the lens corrections folder just so you can see the new files basically. And if I just move this out of the way, get rid of that, and then go to my lens corrections folder, you can see there is the image that I cropped. And there's the two raw files there. And obviously I need to import them because they're 3FR raw files. So if I just import that file very quickly and put it into, let's say, just save states, it's easy. Import. And there's my file. So that's my raw imported. You can see it's the full frame. Simple as that. If there'd been 50 files, 10 files, same process, you bring them in, import them, job done. Okay. Let me just stop saving my. Okay. So once I have the file here, obviously then I would just revert to my normal adjustment workflow. So in this particular case, I could say, right, I want to crop this and straighten it. So in this case, I could switch the grid on or literally just crop. So we'll leave it as a free crop. So I just make sure that all of these tools are working now. As we did on the last webinar, we went through all the crop options. So in this case, I can crop and then remove that section on the outside I don't want. I can then use keystone correction in this case if I wanted to make this level up. So as an example, I could apply very, very quickly. Obviously, you take a little bit more time than I've got. In this case, I'm correcting for the fact that the painting's at an angle on the wall. So that's a bit easier, and so on. And then you'd make those corrections, save it, and then when you're finished, then obviously you would export it or print it, whatever you wanted to do. So quite straightforward, but effectively within Phocus Mobile 2 on the iPad, you have camera control for being able to remotely control the camera from a smaller device. You have your RAWs onto your iPad to then edit into JPEGs, should you so wish, to be able to share immediately, possibly with a client. Then once you've got that, you've then returned to base, you've got all of your RAWs from the shoot within your iPad. Then it's a case of connect up your iPad either through Wi-Fi, or I've done it through USB, so it's slightly quicker. And then you can then select all of the files and just either file transfer or raw transfer. In this case, I did AirDrop across onto your Mac, copy them from that location into your normal folder structure that you'd probably have. So you'd have a shoot name, date, etc., and you put the raw files in. You're then in the same position that you would have been if you had just copied the files from the SD card on the camera. You can then import the files and apply all of your usual range of corrections. Okay. So the next one would be virtual copies. So, or save states, whatever you want to call it, but basically I would say it's a saved adjustment is probably the closest we've got. So as an example, if I take this image, looks quite nice. If I go to the adjustments presets here, you can see there's a long list of the things I've done to this image. If you ever need to get back to a starting location where nothing's been adjusted on the image, import standard or standard, factory standard, would get you back to that, effectively the position that the file was in when you imported it. So as an example, if I select that, that was the original capture. Once I then apply a correction, so for instance, I can adjust the white balance to my heart's content. I can apply a keystone. Let's just do a very quick one. Obviously, you would take a lot more time in terms of sorting this out. Yeah. And then once you've applied that, you can then go into the crop mode, move it around as we did last time, move the crop around, and then I won't do that, it'll take too long, but I can then finish my adjustments and then end up here. So I've moved the image back down, turned it grayscale, and then once I'm happy with that, I can then either click this little icon here, which is a small hard drive, save changes. Incidentally, before we do that, as part of the preferences settings on the system, if I very quickly just go to here, preferences, you should have save adjustments set to always. Okay. That way, every time you make an adjustment on an image in Phocus, and then you may click on another thumbnail or move away, it will automatically create a save state with a date and time setting in here. So you can always, when you click back to the image, think, oh, yeah, I hadn't finished. You can reload that. I mean, it automatically loads the last state anyway. and you can carry on. If it's not set to always save, it'll either move on and save nothing, or it'll ask you, depending on what setting you've got. But anyway, so let's make a small change to this. I'm going to switch off the grayscale so it becomes a color image. You can now see the hard drive icon has become active again, because there's a difference between grayscale and this. So if I click the icon, that creates a save, and that automatically creates the date and time now. If I go to the adjustments browser, I'm just going to float it so it's a bit clearer. That last save state is automatically the default last one. But in here, I can click it and rename it. Okay, hit enter, and that is now a saved state for that file. You can see it's here and it's on that list. You can see I've created a few different ones here. So I can load color straightened, and it puts the file in. Or if I wanted to go to an Instagram crop, I could select it here and then click load. And there we go, it crops it down to a square for me. So all of these can be stored within the metadata. It's just like a text information that the system loads into the relevant tools when you load them. And so this is a way of getting different variations of each frame. But as I said at the start, you cannot compare two states from the same file. That's the one downside using this. It's not a side-by-side copy, unfortunately. If you did really desperately need to do that, you would need to copy the file. But this allows you to have different states, different crops, etc. within each file. And then if you're happy with it, you then have the option as part of here of exporting it, or you can, if you look at the moment, there is the current one. So the current adjustments, which would be the crop, the exposure, etc. And I have, again, an export option there. Oops. And then a user one. So I can copy the current settings and save it as a user setting. So quite useful, does most of the functionality you would expect for a virtual copy. It does enable you to have stored versions within each file. And then you can just call them up, output them, and then call the next one up and output it. So pretty much most of the functionality you were hoping for from a virtual copy. Okay, let's do that. So going to move on now to remote camera control. And for this, I'm going to carry on using the desktop app. But obviously, if you were using Phocus Mobile 2 on the iPad or even the iPhone version, you can remotely control the camera, and the vast majority of functions are going to be the same. 1 second. I just need to power on the camera. 1 second. Okay, so the camera, there we go. The camera is now connected. And as you can see, vast majority of functions that you would normally press on the camera are available. So ISO, full range, you've got your shutter speed, aperture, exposure mode, plus your metering, etc. And in this case, the focus is either manual or single. You've then got the, shall we say, the most important tools, which is the actual take a picture, the capture button. Obviously, the mirror up doesn't function in this case because I've got the 907X connected, and you've then got the live view button. Okay, So by default, in the capture tab, the tools that are available to you are basically camera, job info, then you've got exposure corrections, and then you've got white balance here. Capture sequencer and adjustment browser are also there, but let's just stick to the basic ones first. And so what I'm going to do, activate the live view. In this case, wow. Bear with me 1 second. That's because I left the keystone correction on. Excellent. So now we can pretty much see that it's, in this case, it's out of focus. With the live view switched on, what I can do is click in the image, and it will give me a focusing circle. Now this is a long way out here. So I'm going to try autofocus to start with, and then there we go, just hitting the focus button. So getting it close, and then I can tell by the contrast graph here that that's pretty close. So, and then I can then take a picture. And hopefully, there we go. That's a little bit sharper than the previous one. And again, here I can adjust the white balance, I can adjust the crop, etc., and keystone, no problem at all. But my main settings here, I can then choose, let's just bring this down to daylight. That's where we need to be. Take another capture just to make sure that works. There we go. And so there's my image. The thing to remember here on the remote camera control is that if you make any settings changes, so in this case, I changed the white balance. I also have the exposure setting here that I can tweak. The next capture automatically has those applied. So it always uses what's as the current settings and applies those to the next frame. Okay, so that's one way of very quickly honing in. You can also then take the settings that you had for the good frame and pass that to the previous frame should you want to as well. Okay. Obviously, once I've gone past the capture, I would then revert to my adjustment tab. However, if you find there are certain tools you always use, even within the capture tab, don't forget, it's very simple. You can load them at any point from the tool set up here. So if there's one particular one, maybe on flash control, I can then launch that down there, and that becomes part of my capture tools. And I can then save the layout if that's something I want on a long, every time I use the capture tab, then I can just save that as my preferred layout. Good, right. Just to fill in some of the gaps here that we didn't cover. So within the job info section here, basically your capture location. So as we're shooting tethered, it needs to know where to put the files. Now by default, when you first install it will say Focus Captures. If you change it, it will always remember the last used folder. Okay. You've then got a file name in this case, so you can give it, it might be the job name or something like that as a starter, and then obviously there's an incremental number that's added after that. Alternatively, you have date sequence, just a sequence, or you can actually create a custom naming sequence should you wish. Okay. You then have your metadata. Now, within this system, I have just the basics. So Hasselblad email address, etc. Some basic information about the owner of the images, and obviously the camera information gets embedded in that as well. Okay. And then the rest is the same as we would normally have within the adjustment tab. So basically the exposure tool, white balance, and the sequences, etc. We've covered those bit in previous webinars. Okay. So in terms of the camera remote control, very, very straightforward. As I say, you've got information that you would normally set by hand on the camera anyway, and this allows you to remotely set it, change it to whatever you require. Okay. Let's move on to the final one because time is running on. DNG Export. So let's just say I'm happy with this image here, but I want to save as a DNG. Within the export that we covered previously, if you remember, if I hit export when I'm on any frame or batch of frames, I have here the presets that are in the system. So DNG is one of those that are predefined. There's virtually nothing to change, and to prove that, if I hit edit, you can see that it's a Hasselblad supplied setting. There is nothing else that can be done. Even if I try to create a new one, all I have is DNG and everything else disappears. So this is the simple part, if you like. I can select all of the files that I want to export to as a DNG, choose my renaming sequence if it's going to make life easier, and then export them. So that will then give me a DNG. It would have been useful to remember where it was going, so it went to the desktop. So that's now gone to the desktop. There it is. And what you'll notice is after a couple of seconds, the original preview is removed, and basically a whole new preview, which is embedded in the file with no corrections, no settings, is then loaded. And this is your DNG file. The same thing would be happening if I was to load that DNG file into Adobe Photoshop, let's say, or Lightroom. When it opened, it would see it as a raw, and then it would then ask me to please confirm all of the settings that need to be applied. So you'd have to choose the lens corrections, etc., white balance, and so on. If you want to change it from what was the default from the camera, all of that needs to be then set, which is then applied when it's imported into the system. Okay. I think that pretty much covers everything we talked about, Mark.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Chris. Got a few questions, if you don't mind, just to finish
Yeah,
off.
sure. Yeah, no problem.
So a question from Mark. He said, is there a way to clear all the previous settings for the tethered capture?
Yeah, so let me just get rid of that. So for instance, are we talking about this?
No, sorry, for tethered capture.
Okay, yes.
Think,
So best way to do it. So let's say I've just started my tethered capture and I've done one shot. So let's say this, and I want to clear everything so that there's nothing applied to the image. So a bit like what I had there, I'd left the keystone switched on. All you need to do is go into the drop down of every image, or just that first image in this case if it's tethered, and hit import standard. That takes it back to nothing, no corrections at all. So if I come here, you can see that literally there are no exposure settings, there's no keystone color correction. Even though they're switched on, there is only the, if you like, default levels. So that's the quickest and simplest way. So then once you've got that first frame and you've zeroed it, then from that point forward, as you take the second frame and more, there'll be nothing applied. So it'll be zeroed in, okay? Obviously, if you then make a change to the exposure or whatever to a frame, the next frame will take that, and so on as you move forward. But that's the quickest way. Either import standard, or if you really want to do even the factory standard, it does the same thing, takes it back to 0. Okay.
Okay, great, thank you. Question from John Claude. He's asking about using third-party lens corrections when shooting with a white translucent plate. Is there anything to note there?
No, because the vignetting correction, and to a certain extent the chromatic aberration correction, when you use a white plate, so as in we're talking about scene calibration frames here, if you're going to use scene calibration, you should automatically switch off lens corrections anyway.
Okay. And then a question from Mikhail. Is it possible to shoot tethered to both desktop and mobile at the same time?
No, is the simple answer on that one. Not at this point. If I was connected with my iPad to the camera, I can shoot and save images on the card and the iPad at the same time. But unfortunately, at this point, there's no way of connecting. My iPad I could connect via Wi-Fi, and my computer I could connect by USB. But only one of those outputs can be active at any one time.
Yeah, so you can use the iPad as like a secondary viewer.
Yep.
For example, if you had a client in the studio, they could be sat at the back of the room seeing the images you're shooting without having to disturb you. Yeah.
So within Phocus preferences, you have the option of allowing a mobile connection. So you could connect with Phocus Mobile 1, you could connect to my desktop Mac and actually have access to the images as we shoot, and you can rate them, etc. But you wouldn't be able to access the camera as well, if that makes sense. So only one computer can talk to the camera at a time, but an iPad could connect to the desktop and see the shoots as we go. It would be nice if you could have desktop and iPad connected to the camera, so we have two controllers at once, but at this point we can't do that.
Okay, and then a follow-up question from Mikhail, saying about being able to tether on an iPad. So do you have similar options to change the camera settings on the iPad, or is it purely just to capture using the settings that the camera has?
No, you have full control. So basically everything I've just showed you within the desktop app, effectively the same thing is there. So I mean, if we've got time, I could connect the 907X by Wi-Fi to the iPad, disconnect it from USB to show you. But basically, Phocus Mobile 2 has its own camera remote app, remote tool. And so you get the same thing. The beauty of it is because Phocus Mobile 2 only works with the X1D 2 and 907X. When you go into live view, you can click anywhere quickly on the screen and it will use the pixels from the sensor to quickly focus as autofocus. So I don't have to use the focusing tool. Basically just click where you want the focus point to be and then it will autofocus. So it's actually a quicker system, if you like, for getting to a focused position. The settings are the same, so you've just got a drop down in terms of as you would on the back of the camera. So you've got a drop down list for ISO, aperture, shutter, and so on. And obviously you've got your white balance presets.
Okay, so that's something for Mikhail to have a play with. And last question is from Dennis. He's saying, is it possible to do live view with crop modes? So I think, for example, if you had the camera set to 1:1, like a square crop, will the live view also be square?
Yeah, so basically if you've got a crop on it, yes. So let me just if I apply Where crop and orientation. Obviously, if you've got it set in the camera, also if you've selected 1 by 1 in the camera to start with as an overlay, when you connect to it, that overlay will be active. So let's try 1 by 1. Sorry, bear with me 1 second. Just apply this as a quick crop. So it thinks it's an operation, and let's just see if we can get it to apply. Nope. No, but what you could do, let me just switch that off. What you could do is enable the crop overlay of your choice. So, you know, obviously there's the 1 by 1, there is the like X-Pan plus a 3 by 4 and so on crop overlay that you can select in camera. And for that automatically puts an overlay into the viewfinder for you. And so obviously if you had a live view, it would show you that with the crop overlay.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, that's great. Okay, thank you, Chris. And then just to finish up, there's a nice comment from Roland that I'll read out, saying after the last Q&A webinar, he took some advice that he'd learned and bought a monitor calibration tool and made a custom printer ICC, and he's now very happy with his prints.
Hey, so that's what we like to hear.
Yeah, very good to hear. Thanks for sharing that with us, Roland, and glad it's of some help, and hopefully you've learned some more today as well. Okay, so if I can just wrestle back the control.
Yeah, 1 second. Yep.
And yeah, just to finish up as usual, quick reminder that the next Phocus webinar, similar to today, but with different topics, will be on the 22nd of September. So if you'd like to suggest any other topics for us to cover in that webinar, then please suggest that when you register. And we look forward to hearing your suggestions. Again, any feedback you can give us to the webinar is much appreciated. Tell us what we're doing well, what we're not doing well, what you would like to see. It's always read and taken on board. So it'd be great to get your feedback there. And then another reminder that all the past webinars, including today's, will be uploaded to the Hasselblad YouTube channel. And you can look through all the back catalogue on there for all the webinars we've done for over the last year. And if you've missed any, that's where to find them. And then finally, of course, for any Hasselblad information, hasselblad.com, our website, everything on there from the webinars that we hold like this one and other events, of course, all our products, our partner network around the world, lots of inspiration, images and stories, lots on our history, and it's Hasselblad's 80th anniversary this year, so there's lots of our history on there at the moment. You can request a demo, and you can also receive any support that you may need. So thank you very much for joining us again, and we hope to welcome you again to another webinar again soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.